The second time, my mother handed me to Desmond Okafor like a piece of paperwork. I was standing in the executive elevator of Okafor Maritime Holdings holding a controlling shareholder badge with my own name printed on it, and the man riding down with me, the one who'd once owned the company outright, hadn't figured out yet that the floor he was about to land on belonged to me now. I was 29 that morning, a marine cargo insurance underwriter who'd spent 6 years learning to read a bill of lading the way other people read a face for the one line that doesn't match the rest. And the habit my mother always called exhausting was that I never trusted a number until I traced it back to where it came from. That habit was the only reason I survived what was coming. It would also become the reason the man across that elevator lost everything he'd built on the backs of people too tired or too loyal to check his math. If you're new here, welcome back to Elena's Rebirth life, where betrayal never gets the final word. The first time, I didn't check anyone's math. I was 23, renting a studio above a laundromat in Savannah for $580 a month, the whole place smelling permanently of fabric softener no matter how many windows I cracked, eating cereal for dinner more nights than I'd admit to anyone. When my mother, Yvonne Castellan, called me on a Sunday using the voice she reserved for asking favors that weren't favors at all, she said there was a dinner. She said a man named Desmond Okafor, 46, owner of a shipping and logistics company out of the port, had seen my photo at a charity gala she'd attended uninvited on a friend's +1 and wanted to meet me. She said it the way you'd announce a job opening. I didn't know yet that she'd already accepted $65,000 from him 2 weeks earlier, money she called a gift between friends that went straight to a debt she owed a private lender who didn't forgive debts the way banks did. Desmond took me to the old Pink House Candlelight, an old converted mansion with floors that creaked under the rug even when nobody was moving, and he ordered the wine without asking what I liked. He had a habit when he talked about money of tapping 2 fingers against the tablecloth, twice like he was confirming a deposit had cleared. I noticed it. I didn't think about what it meant. That not thinking cost me 4 years of my life, and then it cost me the rest of it. We married 14 months later, 190 guests, a cake my mother picked without consulting me, and during her toast she held a flute someone else had paid for and said, "I always knew my girl was destined for something bigger than this town could give her." I laughed along. I was 24 and tired of being poor and tired of her Sunday calls reminding me I'd wasted a perfectly good mind on an entry-level desk job instead of marrying well the first chance I got. For the first 16 months, it looked like nothing at all. Desmond bought a townhouse with iron balconies, gave me a car for our anniversary, let me keep my underwriting job as a hobby. His word, which I swallowed instead of correcting because correcting him made the apartment go cold for days at a time. The specific cold of a man not speaking to you across 11 feet of kitchen, the silence so total you could hear the refrigerator cycle on and off. My mother visited every 5 or 6 weeks and never left empty-handed. A check, a small bridge loan, a piece of jewelry she said she only wanted appraised, always handled in the same way, a light touch on my forearm right before she asked, as if the touch itself was meant to soften whatever came next. I counted once, almost without meaning to, sitting at my own kitchen table with a legal pad late one night while Desmond slept. $187,000 moved from my husband's accounts through mine and into hers in under 2 years, always with my signature, because Desmond said it looked cleaner coming from family. I ignored things. His assistant, a meticulous woman named Priscilla Yates, started copying my mother on emails about household allocations. I found a storage facility receipt folded into a jacket pocket for a unit on Ogeechee Road I'd never heard of. My mother's new leased SUV appeared in her driveway 5 months after I signed a stack of papers I was told were just a refinance standard, your accountant cleared it. Except I never had an accountant. Desmond had one. A tight, careful man named Roland Pruitt, and he never once spoke to me directly about anything bearing my own name. The morning everything in that life turned was a Tuesday in September, light coming through old wavy glass and falling in warped stripes across the marble counter, the kitchen smelling faintly of the bleach Priscilla's cleaning service used, a smell that still catches in my throat sometimes in hospital hallways. I had a fever that had climbed for 4 days straight and asked Desmond if we could wait until I felt clear-headed enough to read the papers properly. He set them beside my untouched tea and said, "Your mother already signed her half. It's just a formality. You don't want to be the reason this falls through, do you, after everything she's done for us?" Priscilla stood near the doorway, holding a folder against her chest, eyes down. I signed without reading. One clause assigned my 45% stake in a small underwriting consultancy I'd built from my own evenings and weekends into a joint account that, I'd discover 3 weeks later, had already been drained to $891. By November, the fever was gone, replaced by something worse that I didn't understand until much later wasn't illness at all. I'd started a new prenatal vitamin Desmond brought home from the good pharmacy, and a tea my mother left in the cabinet for my nerves, and for 6 weeks my hands shook in the mornings and my heart raced for no reason I could name, and the urgent care doctor kept saying my labs looked strange but not dangerous. Come back if it worsens. It worsened on the night of January 22nd in a bed at Memorial Health. I remember the particular grit of a hospital blanket against the back of my neck, rough in a way that felt almost like burlap, and a nurse named Carla pressing 2 fingers to my wrist and frowning at numbers that didn't match what the monitor said. I called my mother. I asked her to come. She said, "I have a thing tonight, baby. Can it wait until the morning?" And when I said it might not wait, she said in the gentlest voice she owned, "You've always made small things feel like emergencies." She didn't come that night. She didn't come the next morning. What I learned only after I woke into a different version of that same week. What the toxicology report would eventually confirm, in a life I lived to see it, was that someone had been titrating digoxin into that nerve tea for almost 2 months, slow enough that no single test caught it, fast enough that by January my heart simply stopped knowing how to keep its own rhythm. Not a complication, not bad luck. A poisoning, paced like a budget by someone with access to the cabinet and a reason to want a clean, sympathetic a widower before a deadline neither of us had been told about. The last thing I remember clearly is the smell of the blanket and a thought that wasn't fear so much as flat final math. Nobody's coming and somebody is going to answer for this, even if it isn't me who lives to make them. Instead, I woke up. It was 8:41 in the morning, and the air smelled like printer toner and a Keurig left running too long, and the first thing I felt was the stiff collar of my own blazer, my own hands whole and unbruised, and I was sitting in the lobby of a notary's office I recognized instantly because I'd been there before, signing what I'd been told was just a standard prenuptial agreement, nothing unusual. A young receptionist with a name badge reading Marcus was saying, "Ms. Castellan, they're ready for you." I sat for 1 full second doing nothing at all because the last thing I remembered was the rough weave of a hospital blanket, and now I was 23 again with a phone ringing behind me on a ringtone I hadn't heard in 6 years. I tested it carefully, the way you test ice. "Marcus," I said, "what's today's date?" He glanced at his screen. "The 11th. You need a parking slip, Ms. Castellan?" "Aurelia's fine," I said out of habit, and he nodded like that was the most ordinary thing in the world. April 11th, 3 weeks before the engagement announcement, 6 years before a hospital blanket that smelled faintly of bleach and a heart that forgot its own rhythm. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. Desmond was already in the small conference room, tapping 2 fingers against the table, and across from him sat a notary with a stamp and a folder, and standing near the window, holding her purse against her stomach like a shield, was my mother, 48, in this version of the morning, wearing a rust-colored wrap dress she'd wear again, the same one, because she loved it enough to wear it to 2 of the worst days of my life. "There she is," my mother said. "Sit down, baby. She doesn't have all morning." Last time I'd signed in 12 minutes, eager to be done, eager not to be the daughter who made things complicated. This time, my palms were sweating against the folder's cardboard cover, a small, stupid, animal kind of fear I hadn't expected to still carry in a body that hadn't lived through any of it yet, and I made myself breathe before I spoke. "Can I get a coffee first?" I said. "I'd like to actually read this." My mother's mouth did something quick and small. "There and gone. It's exactly what we discussed on the phone," she said. "Nothing new." "Then it won't take long," I said, and opened to page 1 and didn't look up again for 45 minutes, the cheap overhead fluorescent light giving me a headache behind one eye by the time I finished. Desmond checked his watch twice. His jaw worked once near his ear, only a tell I did never had the calm to register the first time. On page 7, there was language granting Desmond sole discretionary authority over any commingled or jointly designated business interest wide enough to absorb a company whole, and on page 11, a clause naming my mother as contingent beneficiary on a $300,000 life insurance policy I hadn't known existed, payable if anything happened to me within the first 5 years. Why is there a life insurance clause in a prenup? I asked, calm though my voice came out one register higher than I meant it to. "Standard practice," Desmond said, too fast. "It's for your protection, sweetheart," my mother said. "God forbid something happened to you. You'd want me looked after, wouldn't you?" I looked at her for 3 full seconds and felt the old fear move through my chest like cold water finding a crack in stone, the fear that used to make me agree just to warm the room back up. I let it pass through instead of stopping there. "I'll need a copy," I said. "I want my own lawyer to look at this." I left with the folder under my arm, the cardboard corner already softening where my thumb had pressed against it the whole drive down. I cried for exactly as long as the elevator ride down, 4 floors, 1 slow breath in and out, my reflection in the brushed steel looking like someone who just remembered how to swim. I found a contracts attorney named Odessa Marsh, the kind of overworked lawyer who actually reads the fine print, and paid her $375 to mark up every page in red ink that smelled faintly of the cheap pen she used. She circled the discretionary authority clause twice, too broad, strike, or define. She circled the insurance clause and wrote one word, "Why?" "You're allowed to ask for changes," she told me, sliding the pages back, her office smelling of burnt coffee from a pot nobody had cleaned in days. Most people think the document handed to them is the only one that can exist. It had taken me 6 years and 1 death to learn that. I wasn't going to need a 7th. I went back to Desmond with Odessa's notes instead of the original folder and watched him read them at the kitchen counter, the same counter where, in another life, fevered light would fall across the marble while I signed away a stake I'd built with my own hands. He set the pages down. 2 fingers tapped the table, empty this time. "You hired a lawyer," he said, not a question. "I read things twice now," I said. "Apparently it's a character flaw." He laughed, short and surprised. "Your mother told me you'd sign whatever I gave you." The sentence was the first piece of evidence he handed me, unprompted, because he and my mother both assumed the woman across the table still needed flattery before she'd noticed she was being used. I tucked it away like a receipt I didn't yet know I'd need and said only, "She knows me pretty well, I guess." We married 7 months later than the first time, because I insisted on a longer engagement. In those 7 months, I did 3 things nobody in that family noticed. I opened a separate business account at a credit union neither Desmond nor my mother knew existed, routing every dollar of consultancy income through it, instead of the joint account I'd be pressured into within weeks the first time. And I remember the teller who set it up for me, a young man with a chipped front tooth who asked twice if I wanted a second name added to the account and seemed genuinely confused when I said no. I asked Roland Pruitt 3 carefully innocent questions about how shareholder succession worked at privately held logistics companies, framed as curiosity about Desmond's company structure, catching him on a Friday afternoon when he was distracted and answered more freely than he probably meant to, his tie already loosened, a coffee stain on his shirt cuff he hadn't noticed, and I wrote his answers in a notebook kept at my own office, never at home. And I called Aunt Delphine, my father's sister, the only person in that family who'd ever told me the truth out loud, at my father's funeral, in a parking lot that smelled like wet asphalt and somebody's cigarette. "Don't let her decide your life for you, baby. She decided your daddy's too." And asked her Over diner coffee gone lukewarm before either of us touched it, the cream curdling slightly in a thin gray ring at the surface. Whether she remembered anything about my father's side, having money tied up anywhere. She stirred her coffee a long time, the spoon clicking softly against the cup 3 times before she set it down. Your grandfather Augustin set up something before you were born. Your mother fought him on it for years. He didn't budge. Why are you asking? I didn't know yet what that trust was. I knew it existed, which was more than I'd known 6 years and 1 death ago. That was the first domino. The wedding happened at the same venue again. Fewer guests, 142 instead of 190 and my mother went cold and precise for 3 days afterward, a silence that used to terrify me and now felt oddly like room to breathe. At the reception, she stood with a flute she hadn't paid for and said almost word for word, I always knew my girl was destined for something bigger. I smiled the smile you give a stranger on a train and thought, you have no idea how far this falls. The first 14 months of the second marriage looked nearly identical to the first because I let them. I let Desmond buy the same townhouse again. I let him buy a car, though I asked for something cheaper than what he offered, which told me something about how he kept his ledgers of affection. I let my mother visit every 5 or 6 weeks. The first time she asked for a small loan just to bridge a gap, I gave her $3,500 from the account Desmond monitored because I needed her to believe nothing had shifted. The second time she asked for $9,000 toward an opportunity Desmond's people are already in, I told her I'd need to check with my financial advisor first. Since when do you have a financial advisor? She asked in the same kitchen, the same warped light, green instead of fever yellow this time. Since I started taking my own money seriously, I said, and watched something behind her eyes recalculate. The advisor was real, a woman named Renita Okwosa, found through Odessa, who told me, if you want to actually protect yourself, you need someone watching the money who answers only to you. Renita was the second domino. 8 months into the marriage, she pulled records on my grandfather's trust and found it hadn't dissolved on his death the way my mother always claimed. It had simply never activated because activation required the named beneficiary, me, to file a formal claim at or after age 30, a fact nobody had ever mentioned existed. Your mother is listed as trustee until you turn 30, Renita told me, sliding a printout across her desk, a cedar candle burning down near the window, the wax pooling unevenly on one side, which means for 8 years she's had legal access to manage assets currently valued at $1.9 million. Did you know that? I'd grown up eating eggs for dinner some weeks because money was tight, while $1.9 million sat under her management line. I held the printout with both hands because one hand alone wasn't steady enough, and I didn't say anything for what felt like a full minute, just listened to the candle hiss faintly where the wick had started to drown in its own wax. I want every transaction, I said finally. Everything she's touched. It took Renita and a forensic accountant named Octavio Reyes, who billed $295 an hour and earned every cent, 5 months to assemble the full picture. My mother had drawn $12,800 a year in trustee fees, legal if generously interpreted, and had 3 times moved larger sums. $28,000, $39,500, and $54,000 out of the trust into a personal account, each logged as a bridge loan against future distributions, never repaid, each occurring, Octavio noted dryly, within 6 to 8 weeks of a financial hardship verbally claimed to the beneficiary. He meant me. He meant the eggs. He meant a woman manufacturing scarcity in front of her daughter's face while quietly bleeding a fortune that daughter didn't know existed. Octavio delivered this news the way he seemed to deliver everything, flatly, over a desk cluttered with manila folders that smelled faintly of mildew from a basement archive he'd pulled half of them from. And at the end, he slid a single laminated summary sheet across to me, as if laminating it made the numbers easier to hold. I didn't confront her. That discipline cost more than any single conversation could have. sitting across from her at her own kitchen table, eating shrimp and grits she always overcooked at the edges, the smell of burnt butter under the seasoning, watching her reach over without asking and refill my glass of sweet tea the way she had since I was a child, saying nothing, while a folder's worth of her theft sat in a drawer at my office 40 minutes away. There were nights I cried in my car in her parking lot before I could drive home, the vinyl seat sticking to the back of my legs in the heat, the smell of the cardboard pine tree hanging from the mirror, gone sickly sweet after years of sun. Some exhausted part of me still wanting her to simply be my mother, but I'd already died once, believing she'd come if I called loud enough. I wasn't calling loud this time. The third domino was Priscilla Yates. In the first life, she'd stood in a doorway holding a folder against her chest and looked away while I signed my consultancy stake into an account that would be empty within weeks. In the second life, 10 months into the marriage, I started bringing her coffee twice a week, the same order each time because she never changed it, and I learned that small consistency made people trust you faster than almost anything else. I asked about her daughter's volleyball season, her mother's knee surgery, the particular ache in her own shoulder from years of filing. I never asked about Desmond. 4 months passed before I asked her gently, on a slow afternoon when the office smelled like the toner from a copier that had been running all day, whether she'd ever noticed anything in the accounts that bothered her. She didn't answer that day. She turned her cup the way Desmond turned his 2 fingers, slow, deliberate, a habit she'd probably picked up from him without ever noticing, and said, "I have a job to keep." I let it sit. It opened 3 months later on a rainy Wednesday when Priscilla called my personal cell, a number Desmond had never bothered memorizing, and said, in a voice clearly rehearsed and still shaking, the rain loud enough behind her that I had to ask her to repeat herself twice, "I need you to know something, and it can't have come from me." There had been a transfer 2 weeks earlier, $58,000, out of an account holding proceeds from a property sale, a warehouse Desmond owned that I'd never known about, bought quietly with siphoned funds over our first year together, and the transfer had gone to an account in my mother's name. No loan memo this time. The wire description read, "Settlement, services per agreement, April 11th. April 11th. The date of the notary appointment, the day everything in this life had started over. I sat with that wire for 3 days before understanding it wasn't a coincidence of timing. It was a code. I kept the printout in my coat pocket those 3 days, taking it out at odd moments on a bench, in a parking lot, the paper going soft at the fold from how many times I'd opened it. Octavio confirmed it almost certainly referenced an arrangement, and cross-referencing it against an old filing Renita pulled during the trust review turned up a memo from my mother to Desmond's family attorney, a man named Aldrich Pruitt, outlining compensation expectations related to the introduction and continued facilitation of the Castellan-Okafor Union, with a figure at the bottom, $65,000 upon introduction, additional amounts as warranted by continued cooperation. A literal, itemized price list. I almost broke that week sitting alone in my office on a Friday night with the memo printed in front of me, crying steadily, a tear blotting one corner of the page before I could move it, the paper going soft and slightly translucent where it landed. I called Aunt Delphine. She didn't ask questions, just stayed on the line 40 minutes while I breathed, and at the end said, "Your daddy used to say your mama could make you feel guilty for the weather. Don't let her make you feel guilty for surviving her." There was a night not long after when the old fear nearly won outright. Desmond came home late smelling of someone else's cologne, something heavier and sweeter than what he wore, and instead of asking, I made dinner the way I always had, chicken and rice, the same recipe, and set his plate down without a word, and some old, exhausted part of me wanted badly to just be the wife who didn't notice things, the wife who'd never hired a lawyer or opened a separate account or asked an accountant innocent questions. I stood at the sink with my hands in dishwater gone lukewarm and gray and let myself want that. for about 90 seconds before I dried my hands on the dish towel and went and got the notebook out of the drawer where I kept Roland Pruitt's answers, because wanting the easier version of myself back wasn't the same as being her again. The fourth escalation came 9 months later on our second anniversary at a converted old terminal building downtown, white tablecloths, a bottle of wine Desmond ordered without asking, my mother joining for just one course, wearing the rust dress with a loose thread on the hem she'd never bothered fixing in either life. Halfway through the entree, she set down her fork and said gently, Desmond and I have been talking, and we think it might be smart to consolidate some of your accounts under one advisor. It's just cleaner, baby, for tax season. I felt the old fear move. I let it pass through. Which advisor were you thinking? Aldrich's office can recommend someone, Desmond said. I already have an advisor I trust, I said. Renita Okwuosa. My mother's smile thinned by maybe 2 millimeters, a measurement only I would have caught. I've never heard of her. She's very good at keeping things private, I said, and reached for the bread, my hand not quite steady, though I don't think anyone at that table was watching closely enough to see it. The fifth domino, the one that gave me everything I needed, came from Desmond's grandmother, a sharp, unsentimental 93-year-old named Adeyezi Okafor, who'd never once warmed to my mother, not for a single dinner in either marriage. On a Sunday visit 8 months before the end, Adeyezi took my hand in both of hers, paper-thin skin, a wedding band loose enough to spin freely, the room around her smelling of menthol rub, and the particular staleness of a space kept too warm for too many years, and said, You're not slow, are you? I've been waiting to see if you'd figure it out before it was too late. Figure out what? I said. My son set aside a controlling share of this company for whichever of his sons made a marriage that lasted, she said. Desmond's brother's marriage fell apart 9 years ago. Desmond's the only one left running. There's a clause, my own lawyer explained it to me twice, that the controlling share transfers automatically on the 5th wedding anniversary unless there's a documented divorce filing or infidelity on record before that date. She paused, her grip on my hand tightening slightly, more strength in those thin fingers than I expected. You're 4 years and 3 months in. Desmond knows that date better than his own birthday. No, I went home that night and didn't sleep, lying awake next to a man whose breathing had gone slow, and even beside me, listening to it the way you'd listen to a machine you no longer trusted to keep running correctly. I understood, finally, the shape of the trap I'd nearly died inside. My mother hadn't sold me for $65,000. She'd sold me for a 5-year option on a controlling stake, Octavio later estimated from filings, and an appraisal Priscilla slipped me in a coffee sleeve at somewhere north of $22 million. The introduction fee was just her advance. I thought about a hospital blanket that smelled like bleach and a heart that forgot its rhythm 11 days before what would have been our 4th anniversary. 11 days before the point at which a divorce filing or documented infidelity would have permanently voided Desmond's claim, the precise point at which keeping me alive but compliant for 1 more year stopped being worth more than a clean widowhood with the insurance intact and no inconvenient wife around to ever read a document twice. That was the night the plan stopped being defense and became something else. I called Odessa the next morning and asked her 2 questions, not one. The first, in Georgia, if a wife could prove a marriage had been entered into and sustained under financially coercive conditions orchestrated jointly by a spouse and a third party for material gain, could that void succession clauses tied to marriage longevity? Odessa said it could if the documentation was strong enough to support a fraud or undue influence claim, but warned me that a board couldn't simply strip Desmond of shares on the strength of a family scandal alone. A private corporation's bylaws would need an actual triggering clause, something the succession provision itself would have to contain, like a morality clause or a fraud forfeiture clause tied to how the marriage was procured. If that language doesn't already exist in the bylaws, she said, we build the case for criminal fraud and civil clawback instead, and let the board decide on its own that they don't want a felon as their largest shareholder. The second question, the one I asked last, almost unable to say it out loud, my voice catching somewhere in my throat the way it does right before you cry and you're trying to stop it through sheer will. Could a 6-year-old undiagnosed cardiac death be reopened as a homicide if a tox screen years later showed digoxin in a sample that had been improperly stored instead of discarded? She went very quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. That's not a hypothetical, is it? It wasn't. In the life I remembered dying in, the hospital's standard policy had been to retain unexplained death blood samples for 6 years before disposal, a fact I only knew because I'd worked a wrongful death claim once involving exactly that retention window, a detail that had meant nothing to me at the time, just a line item in a file I'd underwritten years ago, the kind of dry procedural fact you forget you know until you suddenly badly need it. If a sample from January in that other timeline still existed somewhere in cold storage, and in this timeline, where I never died at all, there was no reason for anyone to have gone looking for it. No reason for anyone to know it mattered. Then somewhere in a freezer sat proof of exactly how someone intended to kill me on a schedule built around a 5-year clause. It took Odessa 6 weeks to even confirm such a sample could legally be requested without tipping off the people it would incriminate. Working through a back channel with a retired pathologist she'd used as an expert witness twice before, a careful, soft-spoken man who agreed to review the chain of custody paperwork before anyone filed anything formally. He called me himself once late on a Tuesday just to say, in a voice that had clearly delivered hard news to families more times than he could count, that the sample was intact and the digoxin levels, even 6 years degraded, were unambiguous. I sat on my kitchen floor after that call for almost 20 minutes, my back against the cabinet, the tile cold through my jeans, not crying exactly, just breathing in a way that felt like my chest had forgotten how for a second. I sent Odessa everything. The marked up prenup, the wire with the date code, the price list memo, the trust audit, 8 years of trustee transactions, Priscilla's recorded statement, Adeyezi's account of the succession clause. And I sent her one more thing nobody else knew I was building. A private investigator's report, 6 weeks in the making, tracing the nerve T formula my mother had given me in the other life back to an online supplier and a digoxin dosing calculator bookmarked. The investigator discovered through a subpoenaed browser history pulled under a separate fraud filing on a laptop registered to Yvonne Castellan. The search history dated damningly almost 3 months before that January night, which meant none of it had been improvised in a moment of desperation. It had been planned the way you plan a renovation, in stages with a timeline. We had 5 months before the 5th anniversary. We used every week of them. I filed the trust claim the day I turned 30. I asked Priscilla for 2 more documents, a transfer to my mother logged as consulting, though she'd never consulted on anything in her life, and a retainer to Aldrich Pruitt's office logged simply as ongoing matter paid 3 days after the dinner where they'd pushed the advisor consolidation. The retainer was what finally made Odessa say, quietly, "They're planning something around your birthday." Nobody keeps an ongoing retainer with a family attorney for a marriage they believe is stable. My mother found out about the trust claim by accident, the way she found out most things, and called me within the hour, voice bright and clipped at the edges. "You didn't tell me you'd claimed Augustine's trust." "I didn't think it concerned you," I said. "You're not the trustee anymore." "I managed that money for 8 years. The least you could do is thank me." "I'll thank you," I said, "when I see the accounting." She tried once more to fold me back into the old shape, calling 11 days later to invite me to lunch, just us girls, reaching across the table to take my hand, her rings cold against my knuckles, the same 3 rings she'd worn my whole life, one of them my grandmother's. "Everything I've ever done was to make sure you'd be taken care of. Nobody looked out for me the way I look out for you." I let her hold my hand a moment, looking at the table between us, a water ring left by someone else's glass that the busser hadn't wiped away yet. I thought about a nurse pressing 2 fingers to a wrist that didn't match the monitor. I said only, "I know you believe that, and meant it because I'd come to understand her cruelty wasn't strategic in the cinematic way I used to imagine. It was hungrier and more ordinary than that. The fifth and final domino was the gala. Okafor Maritime Holdings held its annual shareholder dinner every May at the old Cotton Exchange building on Bay Street. Brick walls and a vaulted ceiling, the kind of room that photographs well for an annual report. This year's dinner fell 10 days before the 5th anniversary by design because Desmond's father had structured the succession clause decades earlier to be confirmed publicly at this exact event. 220 guests, the board, a reporter, a Des 93 at the head table. Odessa and I planned the evening like a structural reinforcement, the two of us at her kitchen table with takeout containers going cold between us, working out which fact landed where, which document got handed over in what order, because the order mattered as much as the content did. Priscilla, resigned 6 weeks earlier, agreed to attend as Odessa's guest. Octavio prepared a single-page notarized summary. Renita sent formal written notice to the trust firm and to Aldrich 2 days before the dinner, confirming the trust's full accounting had finalized, meaning by the night of the dinner, they already knew the numbers existed. They didn't know I planned to bring them into the room, or that I'd quietly filed that same week a criminal complaint based on the toxicology and browser history evidence, sealed pending investigation, which meant my mother was, as of that filing, already a named suspect in an attempted homicide neither she nor Desmond had any way of knowing was being actively pursued. I wore a deep green dress bought with my own money. I did my own makeup while Desmond knotted his tie in the next room, talking about how his father would have been proud, how the board had been very complimentary about his stability this year, his voice carrying that particular lightness men get when they believe the hardest part of something is already behind them. I said, "I'm proud of you too," and watched his shoulders settle, the knot of his tie finally sitting right after 3 tries. The dinner began the way these things begin. Soft jazz, the clink of glasses, candle wax, and seared fish, the faint mildew smell. Brick buildings never quite shake, even after 100 years of renovation. A smell I'd grown to associate with money trying too hard to look effortless. My mother arrived in plum, the rust dress draped over her arm for later. Air-kissing board members' wives before she'd found her seat. Her perfume the same one she'd worn my whole life, something powdery and a little too sweet that always made my eyes water faintly if she hugged me too long. The company's general counsel, a measured woman named Felicity Drummond, stood after dessert beside a velvet box holding a signed share transfer certificate. 5 years ago, Felicity began, Desmond Okafor made a commitment, and tonight, in keeping with a tradition this family has honored for 3 generations, we're here to recognize. Before you do that, I said, standing, my voice not loud, I think everyone here deserves to know what that commitment actually was. The jazz had already stopped. 220 faces turned. Aurelia. Desmond said, low, a warning, the same tone from a kitchen 6 years ago and 4 years ago when he'd told me your mother already signed her half. It's just a formality now. I have a document, I said, and Odessa rose to hand it to me, the paper still warm from being pressed flat under her arm, outlining a compensation arrangement of $65,000 for introducing me to Desmond Okafor with additional payments contingent on, and I'm quoting, continued cooperation. It's signed by my mother. A sound moved through the room, not quite gasps. 200 people deciding all at once to stop pretending they hadn't been listening. I could feel my own pulse in my throat. Fast but even, the kind of fast that doesn't show on the outside if you practice keeping your shoulders still. There's a wire transfer, I said. $58,000, reference code, settlement. Services per agreement, April 11th. April 11th is the date my mother and my husband finalized the terms of our marriage at a notary's office before I'd even said yes. I held up the second page, my thumb leaving a faint, damp print on the corner. There's a retainer to Mr. Pruitt's office paid 9 weeks ago, 3 days after my husband and my mother discussed consolidating my accounts under an advisor of their choosing. "This is a private family matter," Aldrich said, standing, his chair scraping back hard enough that a woman at the next table flinched. "It stopped being private," I said, "the moment my mother put digoxin in my tea." The silence that followed had a texture to it, the specific stillness of a room where 200 people simultaneously stop breathing through their mouths. My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "I'm not speaking figuratively," I said. "There's a sealed criminal filing opened 3 weeks ago, built on a blood sample the state retained from an unexplained cardiac event 6 years ago, and a browser history showing a digoxin dosing calculator bookmarked on my mother's laptop the month before that event. I didn't survive a complication. I survived being poisoned slowly enough that no single test would catch it, on a timeline that lines up almost to the week with a succession clause that would have transferred a controlling stake in this company to my husband if I died as a sympathetic widower's wife before our 4th anniversary instead of after." Odessa at the head table set down her water glass with great deliberateness, the loose ring catching the light, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. "There's one more document," I said. "The succession clause governing tonight's transfer specifies the share passes to Desmond if the marriage hasn't ended in divorce or documented infidelity by the anniversary. It says nothing about a felony fraud forfeiture provision in this company's own bylaws, which Mr. Pruitt's office knows exists because his firm drafted it 11 years ago, stating that any shareholder convicted of or under active criminal investigation for conduct against a spouse connected to the procurement of shares forfeits eligibility entirely. My attorney filed a motion this morning asking the board to enforce its own bylaw before any transfer is finalized." Desmond's face had stopped performing entirely. "You knew?" he said finally, to my mother, not to me. "You said she'd never look this closely." "I think," Felicity said carefully, "the board will need to postpone tonight's transfer pending legal review of the existing forfeiture provision." My mother found her voice last. "Aurelia, sweetheart, you're embarrassing yourself in front of people who matter." I used to think that sentence meant something. I said, "I don't anymore." I sat down. I didn't watch what happened to her face after that. 2 board members rose within the minute, already on their phones. A detective who'd been seated, unannounced to anyone but Odessa and me, at a table near the kitchen doors, stood and walked toward my mother's chair without hurrying, which somehow made it worse for her than if he had. What came after didn't happen in one night, but it happened steadily. The board, citing its own 11-year-old forfeiture bylaw rather than any vague notion of scandal, formally voided Desmond's claim to the controlling share. He kept the 38% that had always been legitimately his and lost the rest, and within 5 months he'd been quietly eased out of his operating role, replaced by a cousin from out of town. A detail I learned from a Daisy over tea and found didn't make me feel anything at all. He'd become a man I used to know, the kind of stranger whose face you'd recognize on the street and keep walking past. My mother's arrest happened 8 days after the gala, at the apartment she'd already started looking at as a fallback. The lease never signed. I wasn't there for it. Aunt Delphine told me later that 2 officers came to the door at 6:40 in the morning, and my mother answered still in her robe, the rust dress hanging pressed and ready on the back of a closet door for an event she'd never get to attend. The criminal case took 14 months to resolve. She pleaded to attempted murder and financial fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence rather than risk trial on both counts. And Aldrich, facing his own scrutiny from the state bar over the retainer arrangement, withdrew from representing either of them. The civil recovery action Odessa filed for the $121,500 in undocumented trust withdrawals moved forward unopposed. The relationship consequence I hadn't planned for was Aunt Delphine, who called me 3 weeks after the gala, voice rough, and told me she'd spent the drive home that night thinking about the parking lot at my father's funeral 14 years earlier, when she'd whispered a warning and never once followed up. "I knew something was wrong with how your mama talked about you," she said, "and I let it be your problem instead of mine." I told her I forgave her and meant it because She at least had the decency to feel the weight of what she'd ignored. There was one more conversation, smaller than the rest, that I think about more than almost anything else from that whole stretch. Carla, the nurse who'd pressed 2 fingers to my wrist in another life I alone remembered living, never existed in this one. There was no January night at Memorial Health for her to be part of. No monitor going wrong, no version of me she ever met. I went looking for her anyway, once, quietly, just to see if a woman by that name worked the cardiac floor, and found that she did, real and unaware and entirely unconnected to any of it. And I sat in my car outside the hospital for 20 minutes without going in, because there was nothing to thank her for in this version of things and nothing to forgive. And I finally understood that some debts only exist in the life where they were incurred, and you don't get to settle them in the one where you survived. I bought a house that spring, a modest 3-bedroom with a sagging back porch. I planned to rebuild myself, board by board, because I'd spent a career checking other people's numbers for the one line that didn't match, and it felt right to finally build something entirely my own. I closed on it paid mostly from the trust my grandfather had set aside before I was born, and that no one had been able to touch since the day I turned 30 and finally asked what was owed to me. The closing itself happened in a small office that smelled like new carpet glue. A notary I'd never met before sliding papers across a desk that still had the plastic film half peeled from one corner. And I read every single page twice anyway, out of habit now more than fear, while the people around the table waited with the particular patience reserved for someone who has clearly earned the right to take her time. The last image I keep from that whole stretch of my life is a quiet one. A Sunday evening 6 weeks after I'd moved in, standing on the back porch with a box of new locks, 3 of them for the front door, the side door, and the gate. I changed every lock myself, slowly checking each mechanism twice before moving to the next, the metal cold against my fingers even in the early summer heat. A thin line of grease from the hardware working itself under one fingernail that I'd still be picking out 2 days later, and when I was done, I stood in the kitchen with the old keys in my palm, small, dull brass things that had opened doors for people who'd never deserved to walk through them, and dropped them into a coffee can I keep on a high shelf for exactly that purpose, the soft clatter, the only sound in a house that after 2 lifetimes finally belonged only to me. Trust isn't weakness. Giving it twice to the same person after they've already shown you what they'll do with it is the part that costs you everything. Some doors aren't meant to be reopened. They're meant to be locked from the inside by the person who finally learned where the key was the whole time. If this one stayed with you the way it stayed with me to tell it, let me know which moment hit hardest in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and stay a while.